hey, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Poison Pen Bookstore. It is a real treat to have Lisa Jewell here for her first ever appearance here at the store. And I'd like to also welcome the audience on Facebook. And Lisa's here to talk about her new book, Then She Was Gone. And there's a lot to talk about in this book.
I'd say, but careful with the spoilers.
Yeah, that's right. We can't talk about too much.
Yes, exactly.
But it is safe to say that the inciting incident is the disappearance of a 15-year-old girl.
Yeah.
And what's really fascinating about it is, well, lots of different things, but the effect, of course, that it has on the girl's mother.
Yes.
But also, which you don't read about as much, at least in fiction, is the effect that it has on the siblings as well.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about the basic setup for the book, and what kind of inspired you to write it?
Well, yes, so the basic setup is we first meet Laurel, who's a woman in her 50s who is, as you say, still grieving. Well, not even grieving. Her daughter has been missing for 10 years, so she hasn't actually been able to grieve. So everything's fallen apart. She has a very cool relationship with her two other children. She's split up with her husband. She's living alone. She's living a very small life. And then she, avoiding spoilers, gets some kind of closure, which makes her feel like she can perhaps start to move on. And in that window of opportunity, she meets a man in a cafe who she finds strangely attractive. They start dating, and then he introduces her to his 9-year-old daughter, Poppy, and Poppy looks remarkably like her missing daughter Ellie. So sort of alarm bells start ringing, but very, very quietly, and then they get louder and louder as their relationship progresses.
Right, and it's interesting that you start the book 10 years on, and also that. I just wanted to ask you about the sort of the point of view that you adopt in the book. It must have been a challenge, with different points of view.
Yes.
How did that kind of come about just during the writing process?
Well, yeah, I mean, it was originally, I did a lot of rewriting on this and changing direction, and it was originally going to be much more from the perspective of Ellie, the disappeared girl.
Right.
So I started writing from her perspective, and then I introduced her mother. And then I realised that it was her mother's story, and actually I didn't want to go too much into what was happening to Ellie or what had happened to her. So there's a little bit of Ellie at the beginning, and then there's lots and lots of her mother, Laurel. And then about 2/3 of the way through the book, I realised it was time to get inside of the heads of the people who had contributed to this slightly twisted scenario, which I can't discuss without giving spoilers.
We really can't say a whole lot.
It's tricky.
But I mean, just the basic sort of emotional weight of the story. If you think, any parent's worst nightmare, of course, is the death of a child. But the difference between, as you say, the death, which allows you this sort of sense of closure and an ability to grieve and move on, versus a disappearance.
Yes.
Very different, emotional kind of resonance.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, it's like an emotional black hole, isn't it?
Right.
And I can imagine you would just keep hurtling through and through and through, thinking at some point you're going to get to the other end, and then you just never do. I can't imagine how anyone can just continue with a normal life when there was someone there who was everything to you, be it your husband, your wife, your child, someone hugely important to you, and then they're just not there, and they could be anywhere.
Yeah.
And you don't know if they're unhappy, if they're happy, if they're dead, if they're alive, if they're near you, if they're far away from you. And in fact, that was one of the original, when I was trying to come up with an idea for a book, quite desperately, because I was supposed to have started writing it and I didn't have an idea yet. And that was, in fact, the original idea was this idea that someone could be missing, and the parents have no clue where this person is, but it actually turns out that they're basically next door. It's not actually what happens in the book, but that was,
Yeah, you hear stories like that from time to time.
Yes, you do. You hear stories about everything from time to time.
There was there's a story, kind of one of these kind of rock star mythology sort of tales that probably none of you will know, but in the UK you might. There was a musician, 20 odd years ago, the guitarist
Oh,
for
from the
Manic Street Preachers.
Yes.
Yeah, this guitarist who was kind of a lost soul, disappeared
Yeah.
20 years ago, and they still...
And then the conspiracy theories.
theories, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's in India. He's joined a monastery, and
the chances are he just jumped off a cliff. I mean, that's
it was the bridge, yeah,
or a bridge. Yes,
right.
I mean that's more likely.
That's
but
more likely.
Because we don't know.
But you see, it's funny. The reason I bring it up is because you see these sort of impassioned pleas from his sister. All these years later.
Yeah.
Hey, it's been 20 years. If you're still out there, because you don't. As you say, you would still have this little bit of hope.
Yeah. Well, it's a Madeleine McCann story
Yes,
as well.
absolutely.
That's a very similar thing.
Right.
Where we are talking 10 years down the line, and still that flame of hope hasn't been fully extinguished.
Absolutely.
And that's the closure, isn't it?
Well, this whole kind of we wanted to talk about your earlier books too, but we were talking in the back, and this is your 15th published book.
Yes.
And I was saying, did you write your first when you were 13 or what? I mean,
I wrote it before I was born.
Before you were born, in utero.
Yeah, no, I started writing when I was 27. And I published my first book when I was 30.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. And the early books, were they weren't really mystery crime genre so much as sort of romantic suspense? Would that be accurate?
That's a nice way of putting it. Yes, I had to put up with the.
Were they bodice rippers?
No, there was no bodices being ripped or anything like that. In fact, I've only written, I think, one sex scene in my first book, and then I just thought I don't want to do that again. So no juicy sex scenes in my books. No, there was this expression chicklet, which is that was a big umbrella that somebody put up in the
not henlit.
Not henlit, no. Although people have used that expression about books about relationships with older women having relationships as henlit. But chicklet is about younger women having relationships.
Cougar here.
A cougar. Well, yes. No, but a cougar is an older woman who goes after a younger man.
Oh, it's the opposite.
As opposed to an older woman going after a man of her own age or being gone after by. Anyway. But yes, so my first few novels were, you call them romantic comedies, but there was always a mystery. I've always sort of tried to tie in some sort of mystery inside my romantic novels, relationship novels as well. Right.
Now, of course, publishers are always struggling to they want to categorize in some place, and so you hear these terms like domestic noir is their current kind of hot button term or whatever. And, but there is, here in the States, of course, there's the, Mary Higgins Clark kind of started some of that, but the kind of the terror of everyday life, as you were starting to say, it's like, we kind of sleepwalk through life, and all of a sudden, whoa, something very normal. Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
What attracts you to that kind of story?
I think, someone, actually, we were talking about this yesterday, and someone said their teenage daughter had been discussing thrillers with them, and she'd said that she thinks women like reading thrillers or psychological thrillers, or as you call it domestic noir, to prepare themselves. It's a sense of preparation because we do, as you say, we walk through life, and you get obsessed with the little tiny details of your life, and you don't know that what's possibly around the corner is a thing that could just destroy your life in a flash. And if you read stories about things like that happening to other people, it is a sense of it's all neat and packaged, and you'll go through that journey with that character, and you'll come to the end, and there'll be some sort of resolution. And then, so it's a sort of a strange way of preparing yourself for the possibility of it happening to you.
And also, I suppose, people that have had these horrible things get a sense of connection and comfort, possibly.
Oh, I don't know. Would you read a book about a missing daughter if you had a missing daughter? I'm not sure you would.
That's a tough one.
I think you might avoid it.
I wanted to ask you, since there are some of the characters I'd like to ask about, but I'm not sure how much we can actually go into.
Yes, it is tricky.
There's a character, a very interesting character named Floyd. Can you talk much about him and give them a sense of what he's all about, or is that drifting into dangerous turf.
Well, Floyd is the man that Laurel meets in the cafe, and she, gosh, this is hard. She feels that he's just appeared miraculously
when she needs him,
and serendipitously, and gives her exactly what she needs to start moving on with her life. But Floyd has his own reasons for having been. I feel I've already given.
Stop.
Yeah, I need to stop.
Hopefully that entices you a little bit to continue on with the book. But one of your earlier books I really wanted to ask about, which was, and now I'm going to blow the title. Forgive me. It's about the house.
Oh, the house we grew up in.
The house we grew up in, and it involves hoarding and fascinating.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about that.
Oh, that was. If anybody ever says which book did you enjoy writing the most, that was the one. Because it was one of those things where I generally start with an idea and I can't really see the arc until I start writing it, and then I have to find my way through the arc. Whereas with that, it was just built into the story. So it's a story about a family living in this idyllic cottage in the Cotswolds in England. 2 boys, 2 girls, mum and dad. And it starts at the end where the mother has just died in quite horrific circumstances, and her grown-up children coming back to the house they grew up in to clear it out, because in latter years the mother has become a compulsive hoarder, a really extreme example of the disorder. So it was always going to be this wonderful arc of them clearing out the house, and as they clear out the house I can go back through the history of the family and clear out all the...
There's a touch of the Gothic in it.
Yes, it's very
there?
Gothic.
Yeah.
It is very Gothic, yes, and quite claustrophobic. There's lots of scenes where the children are trying to negotiate these tiny little passages through the piles of newspapers and things that she's ordered online and never even opened the boxes, and it's all there. You can't see through the windows because everything's so it's dark. And
Did you ever? I'm sure you probably did. But do you guys know about the Collier brothers? Famous? Do you know?
Oh,
about
is
them?
this the New York? Yes,
Yeah.
Because I did some research. I very rarely do any research, but I did for this because it's so fascinating. And yes, I read about that case in one of the books I read.
Right. Well, E.L. Doctorow wrote a novel about him called Homer and Langley, and there were these 2 brothers who lived in this brownstone, and I think it was in Harlem, and they were complete recluses, very educated men. One of them, I think, had medical training, but at some point they just went into their house and disappeared. And one of them would creep out and make his rounds every night, and just drag stuff back. And I think there are a lot of great details, but when one of them died, he disappeared into the hoard and they couldn't find him. He ended up being like 10 feet away under stacks of stuff. But when they finally cleaned out this place, they had 13 pianos.
Yes, that's it, 13 pianos. I remember that detail.
An airplane.
Yeah.
Just all kinds of crazy stuff.
Yeah.
But that whole the whole hoarding thing is so fascinating, because all of us, might be on the spectrum in some way.
Yes, I certainly am.
We rationalize our hoarding. It's all in books.
But there's the other end of the spectrum, which is, of course, the OCD and the sort of
hoarding garbage.
The people who have to have everything scrubbed and clean and disinfected and everything in its place and everything in order. And
right.
Yes, you can't sleep at night if the doors haven't been checked, and so yes, there is the other end of the spectrum as well. But
also that this notion in your book that a particular location, a particular home, has a lot of power, which is kind of at the heart of the Gothic thing.
Yes. A lot of my books are about houses, actually. I'm slightly obsessed with the idea of writing about houses, because they are, as I
very
say,
interesting.
They contain so much, don't they? Particularly if you brought up a family in a house, the stories that the walls can tell about what's happened.
It's funny because I live in a 1926 home here in Phoenix, which is kind of that's old for us. It's not old for the UK, but you have to you wonder what experiences have gone on in this home.
Yes.
In some they seem to leave some sort of residue.
Yeah. Have you ever read a book called Home by Julie Myerson?
No.
So she's a British writer, and she lives in a classic London Victorian terraced house, as do I. And she made it a project to research the history of the house and every single person who'd lived in the house from when it was built in 1870. But she got very, very deeply into the fabric of the stories of the people and realised them as well. So,
interesting.
Absolutely fascinating book. Yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of these old homes have interesting nooks where you find stuff.
Yes.
You know, we found a pair of polio braces, which was kind of eerie in our house.
With no background story.
No nothing.
No nothing.
No. Well, tell us a little bit about what else is going on with you. You have another book that's coming out in the UK first.
Yes. So I finished writing my 16th novel just before Christmas.
Okay.
And it's coming out in the UK in July, and I believe it's coming out, trying to close the gap between my UK and US publications. At the moment you're a year behind.
Right.
So I think they're bringing out my next book in December. So you get 2 Lisa Jewell books in a year.
Right. What can you tell us about it?
I can tell you that it was a nightmare to write. It nearly sent me off the edge. It's a murder mystery. I wanted to, because this was very, very strange book in so many ways and quite unsettling in some ways. And so I wanted to stick within the genre that I've now got used to writing in, but do something slightly more conventional. So it's a murder mystery. It's a whodunit, and it starts off with a body, and we don't actually know whose body it is. And it's all set in this little fictional community that I've made up in Bristol in the west of England. There's a set of houses that overlook the village. So there's and it's called Watching You, and there's a lot of people watching. So there's one young boy who's got Asperger's, and he's obsessed with watching people in the village and making a log of what they're doing, what time they did it. Then there's a woman who's obsessed with the man next door. She's got a crush on him, so she's always watching him. There's another woman down in the village who's got that psychiatric disorder, which means she thinks she's being gang stalked. Have you heard of this?
Gang stalking?
Gang stalking.
No.
It's a delusional disorder where ordinary people think the government have got people everywhere watching them, and
Yeah, we know that.
Yeah.
We just call it something else.
Is it? Okay.
It's paranoia.
So she thinks she's being watched, and that makes sense. So you've just got this community of people, and everybody's watching everybody, and everybody's got a different idea of what other people are up to and what their real stories are. And meanwhile, you've got this dead body and who, why, how, when, and lots of red herrings being chucked around the place. And it was.
Do you have a police protagonist anywhere?
God, I'm so scared of doing police procedure.
Yeah.
I just get really nervous about it, and I always pull away from it. So you'll see there's a little bit of police procedure in there, and it's all completely wrong. And then I just pull straight, and I've done exactly the same with this. So the first scene is a detective looking at the crime scene and making notes about what she can see at the crime scene, and then it's interwoven with police interviews done in the format of a police interview. But then it's not the same as having a detective who's a character and becomes part of the story. And then the last scene where we find out who did it and why is seen through the eyes of the detective. So kind of getting there, but I'm just so scared of getting it wrong. Or I should know, to be more honest, I'm so scared of doing all the research to make sure I get it right, I think.
And people will tell you if you get it wrong.
Oh yes.
Yeah. Right. Well, it sounds fascinating. A lot of good for the voyeurs in us, right?
Yeah.
A lot of voyeuristic detail.
Yes, and people who like that sort of, trying to work out who done it. It's,
Sure.
The challenge.
Rear window kind of set up.
Yes.
Right. Who else do you like to read? Are you all over the place?
Yes, I'm all over the place.
Okay.
That's exactly what I am. I don't think I have any authors who I would buy purely because they published a book. I'd always want to read what the book is about and read some reviews and get a feel for whether I think it's going to be something I'd like to read or not. So I read a lot of thrillers. I do love reading thrillers. but yeah, I try and kind of shake it up a bit. I don't read classics. I don't reread books. So I always like to read the new stuff, contemporary stuff. I don't go backwards. So
how are kind of audiences in the UK? You know, we talked a little bit about the domestic noir thing. Do they have the same interest in that genre at the moment?
Oh,
or
yeah. Massively so.
They?
Massively so. And my editor in the UK is actually, coincidentally, because I wasn't writing thrillers when I came to her, but she is a crime editor, which has been very helpful, obviously, in helping me find my way into the genre. And I said, do you think it's on its way out? Because that's the way we are in the modern world. We're always sort of waiting for we look at the trend and we look at the obsession, and we're just immediately kind of trying to work out when it's going to die. And I said, do you think,
you can't put girl in the title anymore.
Yeah, well, exactly, yeah.
That's so 2016.
But gone, I've got gone. And she said no, and she would know, she's a crime editor. She said no, as far as I can feel and tell, it's still definitely, still up there as one of the biggest genres.
I think everybody can relate to it.
Yeah, well, it's also just I don't know, you just want something, it's all Netflix and online activity and what have you, and it's also instantaneous and fast.
Yeah. And
you just want that, I think you want that same experience when you're reading a book now, and that's what thrillers give you, isn't it? It's not laborious, you're not sort of...
Right.
You can just whiz through it and devour it.
It's interesting to kind of look at what people are responding to kind of in relation to the times that we're in.
Yeah.
In unsettling times. I don't know, it's interesting.
There is a theory that in unsettling times that people want the soft stuff.
Maybe so.
The fluffy stuff, but actually that doesn't, and that's why I asked my editor, in fact, do you think it's on its way out? But it doesn't seem to be the case this time round. It's a different sort of escapism. It's a different form.
Well, that whole, the whole riff of how well do you know the person that's closest to you? Can you really know?
Yeah.
I think it's just a irresistible.
It is, isn't
story.
it? Yeah, it is irresistible. Exactly.
Do any of you have any questions? That's what I was afraid of.
What did you do before? You said your first book was published in 27. What did you do before that? You just decide I'm going to start writing books now, or what?
Almost. So I was. I worked in the fashion industry for quite some time, and then I got very fed up of working in the fashion industry, and I got a job as a secretary, which I really enjoyed. But I could feel that I had some sort of creative energy in me that I wasn't doing anything with, just answering the phone all day. So I did evening classes in creative writing, and I got some really amazingly good feedback from the other people in the group, which made me think, well, maybe this is something I could pursue. And then I lost my job as a secretary, and I wasn't quite sure what path my life was going to take. And then I had this very fortuitous conversation with a friend who asked me what I thought I would like to do, and I said, well, I'll probably sign up with an agency and see if I can get another secretarial job that way. She said, no, what do you really want to do? And I said, well, I think I'd like to write a book. So she made me a bet. So we actually shook hands, and she said she'd take me out for dinner to my favourite restaurant if I wrote 3 chapters of the book.
So you were bribed into it.
Yeah. Yes, and I actually think a lot of people need that.
Yeah.
Because I think there's this sense, if you want to write a book, that you feel like you need someone to give you permission to do it, because it's such an audacious thing to do, isn't it? It's just like, who do you think you are writing a book? And, it's a real leap of faith to embark on something like that. So she basically gave me permission to do it in the guise of this, I'll take you out for dinner. And she did take me out for dinner. And she also worked as... someone to keep me motivated while I was writing the rest of the book, because I got an agent interested off the back of those three chapters.
Wow.
And there's the friend who'd made me the bet, had meanwhile moved back to Australia. So she made me email her chapters as I wrote them. So I'd email her the chapter, and then she'd write back to me and tell me what she thought. So that kept the momentum going. And then that was my first novel, and I got a really nice book deal with Penguin in the UK, and it was the best-selling debut novel of the year, 1999. It was the best-selling debut in the country.
That's
so
disgusting.
The whole thing, huh?
That's disgusting.
Disgusting, isn't it?
Right off the bat, 3 novels.
Yeah, I know.
Deal.
Yeah, no, it was.
That's
It was all just extraordinary. It all felt very fated. So yeah, it was kind of.
So it wasn't one of those stories where you had to shop it around for 15 years.
Nothing like that. Slaving in a garret and sort of eating dry bread and no, it really was. It was just really good timing as well, because it was off the back of Bridget Jones. So there was a big appetite for women's fiction, particularly if you were young and you'd written a book. There was a big appetite for it, and there was more money in publishing back in the 90s. So they were prepared to take more risks and take on more new writers, and so it was just good timing.
Right, and then you had 2 girls, is that right?
Me gave birth to 2 girls, yes.
Not at the same time, but
no.
Not twins, but
yes.
you had a
yes,
family.
I have. Yes, I've got 2 daughters. Yes.
How old are they?
They are one's turning 11 next week, and the other one is 14.
Has that experience it must have profoundly influenced your writing in some ways?
Yes. Well, yes, I'm writing about children, obviously, which I don't think. No, I would often, my earlier books, someone would get pregnant and that would be the end of the novel. That'd be I never quite,
went the next step.
Yeah, I never went to the next step, whereas now all my novels have, some of my novels have characters who point of view who are children as well, so I like writing about children and also from the point of view of children.
What are your girls like?
They're awful.
Are they headstrong?
Oh God, they're rude and moany and headstrong and shocking. Yeah, but yeah, they're amazing.
Where'd you get the girls in the garden? Those were different children.
Well, where did I get the characters from?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I live on a communal garden like that. Have you read the novel?
Yes.
Yeah. So I actually live on a garden like that.
Wow.
Or from the minute I moved onto that garden, I knew that one day.
That would make you kind of scared eventually.
But it was, and that's actually what the inspiration was for that book. Was that sense that my children are out there, they're in and out of other people's houses. I kind of think I know their parents, but I don't really know them that intimately. And I just had this moment once where they were invited to do a sleepover in the garden in a tent, and there was going to be a couple of adults in the tent with them, and I suddenly thought, actually, I'm not sure I like the idea. I'm not sure I know you well enough for my children to sleep in a tent with you. And that's what the inspiration was. It's just like it's this idyll, and everybody loves everybody, and everybody's children, as I say, are sort of in and out of everybody else's houses. But what's the flip side of that?
Right.
Which has never been the case in real life. It is thus far. It's all been very, very lovely. But so that was exactly what that was.
Okay. It was just really, really good.
Oh, thank you.
Has anything been adapted yet for TV?
No, I've had lots
film?
lots of things optioned. Currently, I Found You, which was the novel before this one, is under option with the Swedish production company that did the Girl with the Dragon Tattoo films, which is quite exciting. And 31 Dream Street, which is one of my much earlier novels, romantic comedy, is, I think, they are. I'm trying to find a vehicle, which is a star.
A vehicle.
Yeah.
Right.
So they're sent. So a famous British writer has written the screenplay, and they're now and he's very well. He's an actor as well, and they're now sending it out to famous actors to read it and see if anybody wants to sign up for it. So that could happen.
Have you tried your hand at screenplays before?
No, I'm a one-trick pony. I don't like this. Yeah, I've got my little comfort zone, and I don't really want to.
How about short fiction?
Yeah, no, I wrote a few short stories earlier on in my career, and then I just realised that I find it really difficult. Really difficult. It really doesn't come naturally to me to do that short form. I need the
whole palette.
Space to
You mentioned that you don't have a certain author that you just follow everything they wrote. But what are some of the books that you've read in the last few years that really...
Oh, right, to go back to Julie Meyerson, who wrote the book called Home, and I don't know if this... I think it's out in the US. It's called The Stopped Heart, which is possibly the best book I've read in the last 2 or 3 years. And she's kind of a literary author, but very commercial. And it's about
That sounds familiar.
yeah. It should have been a bestseller. It should have been international, global bestseller. It's about a couple who moved to a cottage in the countryside following a terrible, terrible trauma in which something's happened to their children, but you don't find out what it is until much later on. So they're grieving horribly. And then it's interwoven with scenes from a family who lived in the same cottage back in, I think, like the 1800s, 1890s. Who are this big, unruly, poor family. There's about 12 children, and
But it's Julie Meyerson.
Julie Meyerson.
Was she the one that wrote Home as well?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. And the two stories are not connected, but there's all these sort of ghostly elements of that you know that this couple were always meant to come to this cottage because of the echoes of the terrible things that happened when this other family were in the cottage in the 1890s. It's just really, it is really creepy, it's really raw, it's really unsettling, and it's absolutely gripping. It's just by far one of the best books I've read in the last 2 or 3 years. So there you go. Oh, you're going to read it now and hate it, but
Well, you won't know.
I won't know.
Do you read some of the real great British contemporary crime people? You know, the Val McDermid and
I don't
Denise
read any
Mina.
pure. I don't read any pure crime.
No?
I like the slightly quirky offbeat. As you said, the domestic noir.
Yeah.
Yes, that's much more my bag. Although growing up, I was Agatha Christie addict.
Really?
Yeah. So when I was a kid, we'd get the library tickets and we were allowed to take 4 books out every week. And I'd go and I'd take 4 Agatha Christies out, and I'd read 4 Agatha Christies in a week, take them back to the library, get another 4 Agatha Christies. But yes, but I don't read any like pure crime now.
Interesting. Yeah. You know, you mentioned a little bit. You know, one of the characters in the new book you have coming is somewhere on the spectrum, has
Yes.
Asperger's.
Yeah.
And they're, you know, does that fascinate you? Different kind of mental disorders and things like that.
Oh yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Although this is a really interesting thing about this character, Freddie, who's 14 years old, is I'd written him to be unusual, and then there was a scene right at the end where he meets a girl. He's been obsessed with this girl and he's been taking pictures of her, and he finally starts talking to her, and she says to him, "Are you an Aspie?" And I suddenly thought, oh my God, he is. And I hadn't realised until I got right to the end that he had, we call it Asperger's in the UK. We call it Asperger's. There we go.
Same.
Asperger's, Asperger's, all the same thing.
Right.
So I'd written this character without realising quite what I was writing. And then it took another character to look at him and see who he was. And then I looked back at how I developed him. And I thought, no, he's fine. I can leave him as he is. He definitely he's on the spectrum. So, yeah, it was interesting. Nice to have a surprise after all these years.
Did you base the mother in the house we grew up in on anyone particular? I love the mother. I had a lot of sympathy for her, and I from the time she started saving her little colored pieces of paper from her Easter things from her children, I just thought she was very sympathetic.
Yes.
And
soft and brittle though. That's the thing. She was very brittle. That was a problem, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And childlike. Yeah. And she was. So another book I read about hoarding before I started writing was a memoir written by, I think she's called Jessie Scholl. I can't remember her name. Something like that. Who wrote a memoir about being the daughter of a hoarder. And she painted her mother very much as this childlike person who just couldn't face the idea of having to act like a grown-up and wanting to cling on to all the joy and purity.
I really, really loved her, though. I really loved her character.
Yes.
Just felt a lot of, like I said, sympathy and empathy with her, and I felt so sad that she almost made it. I mean, with the email.
Oh, I know. And then that terrible death.
Right at the time.
God, how could I have done that to her?
Right at the time. Right at the time.
Yeah, and I'm glad you liked her, because she wasn't. I didn't write her to be disliked. I just wanted people to understand her.
Yeah.
I think.
Do you think there's a different kind of attitude about hoarding? Because there was a big, a few years ago, it was a big deal here in the U.S. There were some shows which I watched every one of them, I must admit.
Yes.
And then I found one in the UK. There was one on cable that I watched.
Yes.
And is there? I don't know. This is kind of a stretch, but it seems like in the American South, particularly, there's they kind of take care of their eccentrics a little bit more.
Oh, okay.
I mean? It seems like a lot of families have, weird Uncle Fred that never could get along with anybody, and we keep him up.
Right.
And there's sort of in the UK, at least the one that I watched, there was sort of a slightly different attitude about hoarding in the UK. I don't know.
Can you explain that further?
Well, it seemed like perhaps there was a certain attitude of eccentricity versus medical disorder,
Yeah.
here in the States.
Yeah. So you're saying it's seen as an eccentricity
Yes.
here, whereas the show you saw in the UK treated it more like a mental disorder.
Almost the other way around.
Oh, the other way around.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Oh, I see it very much as a mental disorder.
Do you?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. I've seen the British shows, and I've seen a lot of the American shows.
Yeah.
So I don't
Mental
know which
disorder.
ones.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. You were talking about capturing sort of lost youth, and you see that on eBay. Anybody can now go and get things that were important to them in their childhood.
Yes.
And it's interesting. Where does that sort of sentimentality kind of turn to?
Yeah. Well, that's the interesting story with all these hoarding shows. Is there was a lady on an American show I watched who hoarded dolls. So she's going to all her local second-hand shops, thrift shops, and the people in them would save the dolls for her because they knew she'd be coming for the dolls.
Right.
And she just had piles and piles and piles of dolls. And then it turned out that she was nursing some trauma, and it wasn't trauma on a grand scale. It was she hadn't been invited to her mother's second wedding or something, and that was the turning point for her. She obviously had felt that she didn't have a proper place in her family, and when she didn't get invited to her mother's second wedding, that was when some switched. Yeah.
Wow.
It's strange.
That is fascinating.
Yes, yeah. But there's usually a turning point, and in the house we grew up in, there was clearly a very traumatic turning point for someone who had a fondness for keeping mementos,
Right.
and then that fondness became a terrible illness.
Well, some of just the standard issue questions. Everybody's always curious about writers and how they work.
Yes,
Do you treat it as a job? Do you have a set routine?
Yeah. I mean, it's changed vastly over the years, but subtly, with pre-children and having babies and small children in the house, and then children going to school and being able to get more time back to myself. And for quite a long time I had to write in a cafe. I couldn't write in the house. I just got to this point where I just could not write in the house.
Distractions.
I mean, not quite sure what it was. So I started writing in a cafe every day. But what that did teach me, writing in a cafe, is you can't sit in a cafe for 8 hours. You can't indulge yourself. It's 3 hours is about the maximum amount of time you can comfortably and reasonably sit in somebody else's establishment. So I did get into really good writing discipline habits doing that, which I've now carried back into the house. I now don't want to go and sit in a cafe anymore. I now want to write at home. So what I actually do is, so I've got my laptop on this side of the dining table. I'm doing all my farting about on the internet and the social media and booking holidays and what have you. And then at work time, which is usually about 11 or 12, I'll move my laptop to the other side of the table, and that's when I start work. Yeah, so it's this psychological thing of this is where I sit when I'm not working, and this is where I sit when I am working, and then when I'm sitting over there, then I don't do any more internet surfing or farting about. So,
So your writing day will start at 11:30 something.
Yeah.
And how long?
As long as it takes me to write 1,000 words.
Okay.
So on a really at the beginning of writing a book, that would probably take me 3 hours.
1,000 words, that's good.
Yeah. And then towards the middle of writing a book, it might take slightly less time. And then towards the end of writing a book, I could write 1,000 words in an hour. So I'll try and write 2,000 or 3,000 words because I want to finish it.
Are you an endless rewriter?
No.
No.
No,
Okay.
no, not at all. Not at all. That's something you really learn over the writing of many books. The first book, I fiddled around with that. You would not believe how much fiddling I did with that first book, and rewriting the first paragraph about 100 times. And but the more books you write, the more you can be businesslike about it and just get the words down, get them out there, and I'll edit it myself to a certain extent, but then best off giving it to somebody else.
Right.
So hand it straight to my editor, and she can do the rest for me.
So how long roughly would it take you to complete a manuscript, a first draft?
First draft, well, by the end of the summer, so I deliver at Christmas, just before Christmas, and then usually start the new book, say March, April, after I've done lots of copy editing and what have you. And then by the end of the summer, I've usually got about 20,000 words, which isn't very much. So September to December is when I write.
Wow.
Yeah, that's
And
when I
then-
become a writing machine and the whole thing comes out.
And then I'm sure you have to do a lot of this kind of thing, go out on the road and promote the book and
Yeah.
all that sort of thing.
Yeah, there are events. It's sporadic. It's not.
Yeah.
Some people, I know some writers who are literally on the road the whole time, going to festivals every single weekend and what have you. But
Is it the same? Here in the States, the book signing's a big deal, and there's a lot of it going on all the time. Is it the same in the UK?
no,
I didn't think so.
no. But we have the festival culture is the thing. I don't know if you have that here.
Edinburgh and
Well, just it started off being a few big book festivals every year. And it's just splintered up and up and up into lots of tiny little book
Really?
festivals in the tiniest little villages in the middle of nowhere have their own book festivals. So you could conceivably, as a writer in the UK, go to 2 book festivals every weekend. And that's that's where writers meet their readers, and that's where you get to hand sell your books to people, and rather than going to bookshops.
right.
Yeah.
Cool.
You mentioned the arc. Do you
Yeah.
know when you sit down and start? You know where you're going. Have you outlined everything out?
No, I don't. I can't.
You just kind of work through it.
Yeah, and that's why something like The House We Grew Up In was a gift, because it was so obvious what journey the story needed to take. Whereas with this, interestingly, this one, I assumed it was going to have a very, very different ending to the ending it had. So I wrote the whole book assuming an outcome, which I thought was going to be a really satisfying outcome. And then I wrote the final chapter, which I thought was going to be really cathartic and moving, and I thought I was going to cry.
Is that the epilogue?
No, that was a very, very last minute.
Oh.
Yeah, that came from nowhere. And then so I wrote this last chapter, which was supposed to make me cry and make me feel emotional, and I didn't feel anything. But I thought, but no, that's the right ending. That's what this whole book has been about, is to get to this moment. And so I tried to ignore the fact that I hadn't felt the way I'd expected to feel when I wrote it. And then I gave it to my editor, and she said, no, that's completely the wrong ending. So there were 2 different outcomes that were possible, and she made me go for the alternative outcome, which
I'll have to ask you about the details
Yeah.
later.
yes.
Was there a particular character in this book that you really felt a sense of connection with, or are there parts of you in all of them? Did you feel sympathetic to them all?
Yeah,
Yeah.
very much so. She's not me at all, but God, yes, I could totally sympathise with her. But I never write in the first person usually, and there's one character in here who I write her in the first person, and it does give you a different sense of connection.
Is that the one whose name we haven't mentioned yet?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, the one.
Okay.
Yeah, and I wasn't expecting that to happen. I knew I was wanting to investigate that character, but I hadn't worked out until I got to that section how I was going to introduce her to the reader. And actually, when I do introduce her to the reader, it's bam, in your face, here I am, this is me, and it was first person, and that was quite exciting to write someone that's straight from their head onto the page.
So you find third person to be more comfortable?
Yeah.
Just as a rule?
Yes, and I think, I don't know why that is, because I really enjoyed writing her, but I think the thing is, when you write first person, it has to be perfect, it has to be spot on, whereas when you're writing in the third person, you've got more leeway to...
Right, to kind of cast the lens all over the place.
Exactly, yes.
Anybody else?
After I read The House We Grew Up In, I went back and ordered all the books I could find that you had written.
Oh!
And there's a difference in, obviously the kind of books, but the characters were always really interesting and likable, and you always felt connected to them. In those books that didn't have to have the suspense on them and stuff, they were still really, really interesting characters that you really
Good,
liked.
yeah. Well, yes, and that's the thing. I find plotting really, really hard, but I find characters really easy and natural. Comes very easily to me.
Oh, that's
to write about people, to make people up and get inside their heads and
we do a good job of that.
Thank you, thank you.
Do your family and friends always think they recognize themselves in your books?
In fact, The House We Grew Up In, my sister said, I felt that was a bit like us, and I hadn't felt that at all while I was writing it. There's no borders in our family or anything like that. I don't know what it was, but there was something about it that made my sister think I'd written about us. But I can't see it, so yeah, there is a sense of that.
Right. Well, hey, I'd like to just congratulate you on the book, and thank you
you.
very much for coming and spending some time with us tonight.
Well,
We
thank
hope
you.
you'll come back.
I'd
and,
love to.
And thank you all for coming out.
Yes, thank you very much for
We'll
coming.
break up and have you sign some books for us.
Okay,
All
lovely.
right. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.